Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome to chapter 3 of Bioethics. And today we've got a lot to talk about. It's it's your first real challenging chapter, I would say. It's full of content, and the concepts are going to be very important for you to grasp as you move forward through the course, because they're going to come up again and again. So this is the time to really nail down these concepts. So the chapter is called Paternalism and Patient Autonomy. And so those two words there at the end, paternalism and autonomy, are really key. I want to remind you that the author has helpfully gathered the key vocabulary within each chapter, and it's on in this case, page 90 under key terms, and he's got it looks like 5 concepts that you need to know. And so be prepared to understand that. They certainly will appear on the quiz. And just remind you that don't feel like you have to go front to back when you're reading the chapters. I encourage you to look closely at the key terms first, and then go into the text and find those key terms where he has them bolded, and then right away look at the meaning of those terms in that particular context. Maybe sort of expand your reading around the concept so that it's taking into like a paragraph or two. So you get the context plus you get the meaning of the term. That's what I recommend as sort of a first stab into the chapter. And then you also have, right after the key terms is the summary of the chapter, which comes at the end. And so that too I would encourage you to read before working through all the material in the chapter. So what that does is it gives you the highlights in the chapter, and it gives you probably 50% of the information you need for the quizzes. So it's a very, I think, efficient way to approach it. I encourage you to do it, of course, whatever works for you. What I want to do is, first of all, mention something about your capstone assignment in the class. It's the case study essay. And the assignment is uploaded for you. And what I want to do over the course of the next couple weeks is talk about how you approach this assignment. And then I'll talk about some of the steps, specific steps that I'm going to throw your way and that you will need to be able to respond to sort of check off your progress with me. I will probably get into that part of it, the progress part, in the next video. For this video, I merely want to point out to you that in your readings from this point forward, you have a section in between the instructional part of the text and the primary and secondary readings, the sort of supporting articles that go with it. In between there, wedged in between, are usually 3, sometimes 4 case studies. Okay, so it would be a good practice for you to look at each of those case studies and think about, okay, if this was the case study I was assigned to do, how would I approach it? Okay, so what you have, and I'm just going to look at the first one with you. This is on page 91. So what you have is a write-up. It's an informative, explanatory narrative, short, like it's only 1 column, and it lays out the facts of a case, and so these are real world cases, things that actually happened. So case 1 is called Faith Healing Parents Arrested for Death of Second Child. And what the case does is it points you to the philosophical issues that are going to be necessary to deal with, to confront, in order to develop a response, what you think is the correct answer, or what is the best policy, or, if it's a dilemma, how do you resolve the dilemma? What's the best way to do that? So what you have then are the facts, the details of the case, what actually happened, the what, where, when, who kind of stuff. And you also have then oftentimes a citation that points you to the philosophical issues. For example, in this case, you have the state intervening on behalf of a minor child to enforce treatment. Now, the principle of autonomy usually extends to parents having say-so over medical treatment for their children, for their minor children. And it takes something extraordinary to violate that autonomy, because that's considered part of patient autonomy, since the parent is the primary person responsible for the care of the child. So you have this issue raised in this case. Now there are other issues, of course, that aren't strictly related to the moral dilemma of autonomy and whether it's right or wrong to violate autonomy in this particular case. For example, there is sort of a religious objection here. All right, so that involves other constitutional principles that are also have to be considered in resolving it. Okay, so if you look at the end of the case, then or each of the cases, you're given a section of questions by your author. And what those are prompts to sort of direct you to developing an answer to the case. And so I just want to read them for this particular case and give you some idea of the kinds of questions that you will need to be able to formulate and pose for yourself in order to proceed with writing the case. Okay? So I'll say more about that in just a second, but let me just read the questions to give you a flavor of what you will need to be thinking about. Okay, so I've mentioned already the case write-up, facts, details, who, what, where, when. Okay? Questions. Do you agree with the court's sentence of 10 years of probation? Should the sentence have been harsher? Why or why not? Do you think that parents should have the right to reject medical treatment for their children on the basis of religious beliefs? What moral principle would support your judgment? Ooh, there's the big question, right? Should religious liberty be construed to allow parents to do anything with their children as long as the actions are based on religious considerations? If not, what sorts of actions should and should not be allowed? So if you think about those questions, and if you're looking along with them with me as you watch the video, the thing that becomes pretty clear is you are being asked to provide criteria for making a specific moral judgment in this case. Okay, and that is not easy to do. But these are the kinds of questions that you would need to pose to a case where you're given the factual part of the case, as you will be given five cases to select from in the case study assignment. And then your job then will be to do the research. There's lots and lots of links provided to give you different sources to investigate the facts for yourself. So you do that kind of gathering part yourself, but then to identify the question or questions that really need to be answered to resolve the ethical dilemma. Okay? And what I want to do is stress here the helpfulness of these questions that appear in your text, and you can be thinking along those lines. Now, those questions already know what the bioethical issues are that are raised by the case. Okay? And so that too is something that you'll have to do. You'll have to identify, well, what are the bioethical issues here in this case? Is it a paternalism case? Does it involve autonomy, patient autonomy? Are there other things that it involves? And of course, we're gonna pack out the kinds of issues, topics that it could involve. Okay, so I just wanted to point you to the cases for evaluation and encourage you to not skip over those, but to start using those to fuel your own thinking about the case you select. Okay? All right, I think that's all I want to say about that. Yeah. Wow, I spent a long time talking about that. I didn't realize that. Well, it's a fairly short chapter, and the elements in it are going to be pretty straightforward. And I've given you 2 of the supporting articles to read as well. So it isn't really that much reading this time around. So let's get right into it and talk about these main concepts. So starting on page 81 in the instructional text, the first key term, and the key term is going to be, throughout our readings, is autonomy. And this means a person's rational capacity for self-governance or self-determination. Auto, the prefix there, means self, and nomos is the Greek root of, that is anglicized as nomi in this case, but nomos means law or rule. And so self-rule is what autonomy literally means. And in this case, autonomy is the capacity or the ability to self-rule. Okay? So this gets to questions of choice and decision making. All right. Now, the autonomy principle then is a moral claim. Okay? Autonomous persons should be allowed to exercise their capacity for self-determination. Okay, so notice the principle. The principle builds on a definition, sort of a factual definition, right? That autonomy means this: that if you have the rational capacity for self-rule, then by this principle you should be free to exercise it. Okay. Now, obviously, the questions become: well, always? Is that an absolute principle that is never open to exception, or is it a qualified or relative principle that does have to consider exceptions? Okay, so notice though that in the principle, this is a general moral principle, and the clue, the word clue in it is the word should. So whenever you see should and ought, that language tells you that it's a value claim. Okay? Paternalism. So that's the real subject of this chapter, and it is defined for the first time on page 81 as well at the bottom. So paternalism means the overriding of a person's actions or decision-making for his or her own good. So paternity, if you look at the cognate of the word paternalism, that means parentage. And so paternalism is someone functioning in the role of a parent. Okay, and then that means someone who then makes decisions for someone who is regarded to not have the rational capacity, or ought not to have the rational capacity, ought not to be allowed to exercise the rational capacity to self-rule, to make their own decisions. Okay, so paternalism is then the overriding of autonomy. Okay? So there are two forms of paternalism. Excuse me. So, and I just hinted at them both there. Weak paternalism refers to paternalism that's directed at persons who cannot, and stress there, I should have highlighted cannot act autonomously, or whose autonomy is greatly diminished. So if you think of someone who is, say, mentally incapacitated, or is severely emotionally disabled, or an infant, you can come up with your own list. So paternalism, according to weak paternalism, then it is acceptable, morally acceptable, to override the ability, whatever ability to self-rule that such a person has, that it's permissible to override that autonomy for their own good. So then the other form of paternalism is, not surprisingly, strong paternalism. And so it's stronger because now you're not just saying that it's permissible to override the autonomy of someone who cannot act autonomously, but you can override, strong paternalism says, you can override the autonomy of someone who can act autonomously if allowed to do so. So yeah, the technical definition then is the overriding person's actions or choices, although he or she is substantially autonomous. Okay? So you see why they're called weak and strong? Has to do with the subject whose choices or autonomy is being overridden. Okay. All right. So let's look at then where these concepts come into play in bioethics. And the first and major state or major bioethical issue is refusing treatment. Okay. So the discussion of this is pages 80 to 84, and there's some contextual information about the sort of professional roles of doctors and other caregivers, nurses especially, and who makes these kinds of choices. The courts have established the principle that a competent patient has a right to reject recommended treatments, even life-saving ones. Okay, and they have stated that very emphatically. So there's an example of that. Let's see, of the famous case here. I think it's 86. Yeah, 86. No, it's the next one. It's on page 88, classic case file, Elizabeth Bouvier. So if you look at that, I mean, you'll see that the courts have defended a strong autonomy principle, and so that extends as far as someone who is making a choice not only to request treatment but to refuse treatment. Okay, and that then the professional, the doctors, the caregivers are required then to honor that choice, even if it means that they are rejecting treatment that could save their lives. Now, you have a nice case that if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a really good case in your 5 to select for your case study essay. It's about a 17-year-old who wanted to refuse treatment, and they forced her to receive chemotherapy. So have a look at that, and you can start thinking about, okay, well, how do I sort out the relevant issues here, and what kind of moral approach, ethical approach is going to be helpful for solving this. Okay. And when I say ethical approach, I mean the theories that we talked about in chapter 2. Okay, so the right to refuse treatment is not absolute, but comes into some problems, as I just alluded to, when the patients are minors. I mentioned a 17-year-old, right? And it also is troublesome when parents reject medical treatment for their minor children. Okay, and we have the case that I mentioned as an example for you to look at. The first one that's in your text on page 91 is about that. So yeah, it's one thing to reject treatment for yourself. It's another to reject treatment as sort of an authorized, responsible adult for a minor, okay, or other person who is of limited rational capacity, or at least regarded as limited rational capacity. Okay, next concept is physician autonomy. This is looked at in depth on page 84. Physician autonomy. So now we were talking about patient autonomy. Now we're looking at physician autonomy. The freedom of doctors to determine the conditions they work in and the care they give to patients. So this is sort of the expertise, the respecting of education, training, and expertise that professionals have obtained, and the credentials that they have earned as a result of their education and training. And so by virtue of that, they have earned this principle of physician autonomy. Okay, and so the things that challenge that autonomy are certain environmental pressures, let's call it. So, if they are if they're not seeing enough patients, they're not being productive, right? You gotta get through all the patients. Okay, so those kinds of expectations, performance expectations that don't technically have to do with patient care, become things that will restrict or direct physician autonomy in certain directions or limit it. Other pressures, pharmaceutical companies that encourage the use of expensive treatments of marginal efficacy. Okay, so you've heard of big pharma. So this is the sort of political wing of corporations, or a conglomerate of corporations who lobby for legal protections and for protection for doing these kinds of things, where they're encouraging physicians to be participants in studies and to try out new drugs with maybe unproven effects. So that too, they can sweeten the pot and make it beneficial for the physician to take the pressure that's put on them by the pharma company and put it onto the patient. So that too, that process really extends to not just physician autonomy, but patient autonomy as well. And by the way, you have a case to select from that has to do with this process here. So there's a big pharma case that you might be interested in if this interests you. And then patterns of physician reimbursement that encourage procedure-oriented interventions and minimize counseling. So there you are rewarding financially or in some other compensatory way the physician who encourages and succeeds in having patients undergo procedures that are going to be more costly. Why? Well, because then that improves the bottom line for the hospital, or it has repercussions for insurance reimbursement and so on. Where maybe a more deliberately reflective process, what's called counseling here, where the patient is encouraged to think about it and then come back with questions and talk more about it and weigh the pros and cons more. So this too can be a pressure on a physician to sort of override what might be the best practice for other considerations. Okay, I don't know if this actually is, the full thing is on your window here. It may have cut off, but the concept of medical futility is, this is where physician autonomy and patient autonomy will often conflict. And so what is medical futility? It's the alleged pointlessness or ineffectiveness of administering particular treatments. It's the word alleged there. That's an interesting choice of words by the author, because it refers then, futility then is based on probabilities, not demonstrable facts. So it may be that administering a particular treatment is likely, or very likely, to be ineffective or pointless. And so, what's the threshold for that likelihood where you would say it is genuinely futile to proceed with this particular treatment? Okay, so physicians may claim that a treatment is futile and therefore should not be used or continued. There's the physician autonomy in the process. Patients or their surrogates may reject the label of futility and insist that everything be done that can be done. So there is the patient autonomy coming into conflict, possibly, with the physician's autonomy. And so which side which side overrules? Well, it depends, doesn't it, on what kind of paternalism is allowed. Is there strong paternalism? If so, probably the patient loses that argument. Is there weak paternalism? Probably more unsettled or unclear which autonomy should or will win out. Or maybe the autonomy principle is sort of strictly respected. In that case, the patient is probably going to win that argument. So physicians, for their part, appeal to this principle. Physicians are not obligated to provide treatments that are inconsistent with reasonable standards of medical practice. So that is appealing to their expertise, their training, their knowledge, that then is based on some communal guild level knowledge that is shared, across the profession. Okay, so that idea of reasonable standards of medical practice, that is sort of captures kind of a legalese way of saying that trust us, we have the training, we have the knowledge to be able to recognize when treatments will be futile, and that if we deem them to be futile, we are not obligated to provide those treatments, regardless of what the patient wants. Okay, so that's what the physicians will appeal to if they are challenged by the patient's autonomy. Or, I'm not saying that all physicians would do that, but that's what they can appeal to. Okay, so now we need to look at the fun part of what we do in this course, which is let's consider these ethical issues in light of the moral theories that we've looked at in Chapter 2. So if we look at utilitarianism, it definitely allows for the possibility of paternalism. Remember, it's after the overall good for the most number of individuals. And so it recognizes that there are trade-offs, there are moral benefits and moral deficits here. But as long as the decision is one in which the overall good is maximized, then if that involves overriding autonomy and having policies of paternalism, that's fine. That's acceptable, morally acceptable under that theory. Now, utilitarianism, I should stress there the word allows. It doesn't mean that utilitarianism requires paternalism. It just means, as a theory, it allows for the possibility that paternalism is the correct policy to have. Okay, next one. Kantian ethics rejects paternalism. Probably, I think of all the ethical theories that we're studying, you can probably bank on Kantian ethics has probably the strongest rejection of paternalism. And then natural law theory is another serious contender in the context of healthcare and bioethics. And so there you would have a theory that is more paternalistic than Kantian ethics, as I think probably most theories are. So natural law theory and utilitarianism are going to be more likely to support paternalism. Okay, so now this is an important part of what I want you to be studying in your text because it has to do with nursing. And I've chosen for your readings the two philosophical readings on nursing and the role of nursing when it comes to these issues. And on pages 86 through, page 86, really through the end, your author talks about the moral conflicts that arise in nursing. This goes into depth on page 87 in particular. So nurses have to come to terms with many of the same moral questions and principles that weigh very heavily on physicians. So you think of the medical oaths that physicians and nurses would take. So there's a strong commitment to beneficence over patient autonomy. So in other words, we need to positively do good even if the patient doesn't want us to do good, or the patient's judgment is somehow not seeing the good that our care would do for them and is making an unwise judgment. So yeah, the force there would be, to do what is beneficial for the patient. So there, when you hear that kind of language, you can be thinking utilitarianism is the moral theory that will strongly support that. Patient-provider confidentiality. This is where the information that how I put it, the information that a patient gives has to be protected, guarded. Why is that? Well, a patient has to know that they can trust their caregiver with facts that may be unpleasant or embarrassing, humiliating, and the provider needs sometimes that information in order to give them the best care. If certain information that is relevant, to their health and their healing is kept from the provider, then that can impair the provider's ability to make the best medical judgment and recommend treatments. So there's the issue of trust between the patient and the caregiver. So that's related to truth-telling, this kind of openness and not just, as they say on the witness stand, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So it's that whole truth part of it that's so important in that patient-physician and patient-nurse relationship. Then, of course, the refusal of treatment. So that gets to the issue of patient autonomy there, and those cases when even what the caregiver recommends and encourages is rejected by the patient. Informed consent, right? So that is the process of making sure a patient has all of the information needed to make a fully informed choice regarding their health. And then futile treatment, which we've already talked about. Okay, so now what about the relationship between nurses and physicians? And this gets to the heart of the two readings that I've got for you. The traditional notion of a nurse as subordinate to physicians, make sure you understand that word, subordinate, versus the idea of a nurse as a patient advocate. Okay, so that is a more... it looks at the role of the nurse in a different light. It's a patient advocate role than the sort of traditional role, which we'll talk about in a bit. Another issue raised is the obligation, the nurse's obligation to follow doctor's orders versus the nurse's duty of beneficence toward the patients. So, what if a doctor, gives an order for, delivering some medication, or changing a medication, and the nurse believes that the doctor made a mistake. What is the nurse supposed to do there? Is she supposed to follow the doctor's orders, without questioning them? How does she or he navigate that concern with the physician? I don't have my water. Yeah. Okay, and then lastly, what's the nurse's duty to physicians when their orders seem clearly to be in error? Oh, wow, I just mentioned that, didn't I? Likely to harm patients or obviously in violation of the patient's autonomy. Okay, so that gets us to the readings then that I've selected for you. And these begin where? There's some good ones, and I hope you like the ones I picked. They're rich readings. They're philosophically strong readings, but the topic area is maybe not quite as interesting for some of you as some of the other ones, like the ones that have to do with futile treatment. So in that respect, I hope you find these two readings useful. So the first one is starts on page 128, In Defense of the Traditional Nurse. The author is Lisa Newton. And just in summary, I mentioned her argument. It's chunked up really well for you in the text. So, take that chunk approach to the reading. I recommend, where you see those bolded headings where the chunks are given to you, that you just take a moment to just scratch out a sentence or two summary, paraphrase what the point was of that chunk. Okay. All right. So Newton rejects the contemporary model of a nurse as an autonomous professional. So essentially an equal partner with physician would be that contemporary model, who has a different kind of training, not a lesser training than the physician, but who is empowered to make choices, decisions in his or her own professional opinion that is the best for the patient's care. Newton argues instead for the nurse's primary role, and I highlighted role there because Newton takes some time to carefully define what she means by role. She argues for the nurse's primary role as a caregiver in the vein of or like a surrogate mother. So notice there the language, the metaphor of mother, a surrogate mother in this case, is a parent, right? And so she is talking about the caregiving role as a paternalistic role, where you're thinking of yourself in that role as a nurse, where you're caring for someone who is at least physically suffering harm or incapacitated, and you're caring for them because they can't care for themselves. Okay? An implication of that role, though, is that because that is what her job is, according to Newton, his or her job, I keep doing the gender thing about nurses, is that the nurse is subordinate then to the physician and will defer to the physician's judgment about the kinds of treatments and actions that are deemed that are deemed by the physician to be medically appropriate, medically necessary. Those are the kinds of decisions in the hands of the physician. And she argues that the clear lines of authority are crucial to prioritize patient needs and efficient management of healthcare facilities. So if you want the hospital to run well, you need some kind of structure like this, some kind of organization like this, where the roles are defined in this way, according to Newton. And even more important than the efficient institution is then what kind of care does the patient get? How do the ways these roles are conceived and the way they're implemented, how do they affect patient care? Is the position she rejects, can she show that it is more likely to harm patients and not give them the best care, as well as show that the role the structure that she's defined with the nurse as surrogate mother, as caregiver, is more likely to give the patient the best care. Okay, your second reading is by Helga Kuz, and that starts on page 136, I think. 136, yes. And the title is Advocacy or Subservience for the Sake of Patients? ? So it's an either or. Is it best to be an advocate or subservient? In other words, the physicians. So if I were to rephrase the title, it would be, are nurses independent advocates, or subservient to physicians for the sake of the patients? This is exactly the question that Newton is trying to answer, and she answers it in this. The answer she gives is the second one, right? So Coos is going to answer with the first option. So Coos sees she poses Newton's position about the nurse's roles or functions in the institution, and she argues that the nurse's subordination to physicians isn't necessary for effective treatment or efficient management of healthcare facilities. And so she instead argues that this role of the nurse is to be a patient advocate. And so she goes further, though, than to say that it really isn't necessary to have this subordination and structure in place between physicians and nurses. Rather, she goes even further than that and says that if you have that structure, it's more likely to harm patients. Okay, so that's a more contestable and interesting claim. So have a look at these readings, and I'm going to post questions that you can write a short answer to in your quiz for these. And I think that's all that I have for you today. Let me see if there was anything else. That's the end. Once again, well over 30 minutes. I just talk a lot, I guess, but I hope this is helpful to you. And now we're starting to get into the real meat of our material. And so as it gets more difficult, feel free to reach out, and I'll do my best to answer your questions and clarify anything that needs to be cleared up for you. And best of luck on your quiz, and I will see you next time.